we wanted to now zoom out and probably like also somewhere like focus more on the publicness of digital public infrastructure, and what is this conception that goes in the DPI literatures? What, in your understanding, is the conception of public? What do you think are its major challenges, like limitations? And if you think about the future, if you think it as a possible technology, if having certain kinds of like holding certain promises for democracy, what would those promises be? What would those perils be?
The promise of DPI was actually something bigger than that. And in my mind, it was twofold. One was, can we exponentially expand access to services to people, right? And for a country like India, many other developing countries which have this kind of population scale, doing that would be transformative, right? The second thing was, can we distribute the ability to solve problems? So instead of one company or one government entity trying to solve a particular problem end to end with an end to end digitized system, which was already happening, is there a way where we can think of, public sector entities, private sector entities, community based organizations, all using the same technology building blocks to solve different parts of the problem? There's some evidence coming in. I think last year there was this University of Michigan study that looked at UPI in certain districts, its impact on household income. Household incomes were increasing in places that had higher intensity of digital transactions. I like to think of DPI as having sort of three main components, right? One is the technology layer, then the governance layer, and then what I like to think of as the community layer. And I think all these three components are equally important if we are going to go in the direction of realizing the promise of DPI.
Because part of the what this DPI is going to do is doing for us is going to do for us is to allow us to collect data in various forms, right, and then bring it together in order to generate possibilities that previously did not exist. Now, this is where I think some significant sort of questions start to arise. In the sense, when this kind of intermingling happens, where are certain responsibilities for data? How are they going to be? Who's going to take responsibility for them? First of all, there are questions of what qualifies as data that is to be collected, right? But one of the things that now happening is that with the emergence of big data, or what used to be called non-parametric statistics in an earlier era, right? You have categories that emerge as a consequence of data that you're actually collecting. It enables you to address certain temporally emergent issues and problems.
Flow of the data now contributes more toward GDP than the flow of physical goods, right? So we are in an era where data is obviously playing a very pivotal role, right? So the actual data that is being created by platforms, etc., is 80% of revenues for the big tech companies, and they are the top of your Wall Street stock exchange, etc. Right? Very well funded by venture capitalists and all of that. So the internet, as it was designed, is not delivering. The data that was being created is getting increasingly privatized, right? Yet data is almost entirely being used mostly for private purposes, right? In the bigger scheme of things. So data is a raw material, I'm trying to argue, unlike unprecedented in the way it is collected from us, free, right? In the way that we give our cultural labor onto these platforms. Yet that free labor is converted into a private good and then sold endlessly as advertisement, right? Mostly. How does one rescue that? Just like your, intellectual labor that should be rescued from these, business models, right? So that for me is the principal challenge for how do we rethink the publicness of these, of the infrastructure. And the last point I would say is, particularly for UPI, what is interesting is, you have a brilliant digital infrastructure, right? The publicness of that is to some extent, yes, evident, right? Because of the number of people who have come onto this platform. You've replaced Visa and MasterCard by two other players who are equally, foreign entities, right? If that was your actual intention to create a more accessible point, then why did it stop at that, right? What is the deeper political economy of the market that is operating here, if it is about public, right?
When we think about like questions of accountability, when you raise this question of exclusion, right? Who do I go and raise questions of exclusion to, right?
If you look at the data centers and we're, trying to examine that part and data brokering, right? There is just no logic at the end of the day why. And if I would ask how many apps are there on your phone, most of you will give me an underestimate, right? There are over 100 apps in your phone. Each one of them, unless you have tried very hard to make sure that those apps are not taking your data, all of these apps are taking your data. But at the end of the day, you would wonder, why should all these apps be all the time extracting data? It's redundant, right? I think we need to perhaps move to the ways collective data is being used, right? And there is where the public good argument comes into focus more. Right? It seems the DPDP bill is much more keen to find ways to get access to your data. So DPDP bill is not citizen facing. I mean, that's my take on it. It's much more state facing. Right? So what does the state do with the data is a question that we have to think a little harder about. Why is it not the citizen coming into this picture in terms of accountability? A question that we've raised.
I wanted to make three larger points. One is to first respond to the question that Manohar posed about the invisibilization of workers. I'm going to pick up on what you said, Shishir. See, all this is taking place. We have to understand, the people say the world has changed, but, we're still living in a world which is characterized by informational capitalism, right? Where what we're indulging in is extracting data as the source of a new source of surplus, right? That is really what is happening. It is also taking place in an environment over the last 30, 40 years where borders have come down. I think it's worth invoking what Marx said. He made this distinction between absolute surplus extraction and relative surplus extraction, right? So you had heightened prospects for relative surplus extraction because of changes in technology. With a lot of this data now sitting in servers across the world, controlled by capital from across the world, the whole notion of a traditional public good is out of the window. So you now have to go beyond it. You have to think about it as a global public good. Now, what global public goods require, as the pandemic taught us, is that you need global governance mechanisms, right? All these technologies work efficiently, and I use that term deliberately, when you scale. Okay, you can't have a server for a village of 358 people, or you can't have technologies that operate at that scale. You're going to have to run this scale. That is even the whole idea of the DPI in this country, right? You have to build the scale. The question is, who has access to this data, this community level data, community level ideas that are coming through? Is it possible for somebody sitting in Delhi, right, to potentially have access to these things? Being at the frontier of the digital revolution has three data points. One, we want to generate work in an employment in a country where work opportunities are limited to non-existent. B, as being part of a global economy, we want to attract venture capital money, right? So we tick off both those boxes because all these platforms are like froth on your beer. Like all of them are floating on VC money. Most of them have never made a paisa of profit, right?
In my mind, the DPI approach came in exactly as a response to that, as a response to the problems that we could see with private platforms. That can we go in and build differently? Can we sort of have a different sort of framework here? Let's not think narrowly about the public interest. Let's think about public value maximization. And that to me, I think, makes sense as also the only non-academic on this panel. When I think of the public in DPI, I think all of the publics are important. First thing we need to do is keep track of this disintermediation. It should not happen. The second thing is, I think, and this is a new sort of opportunity that we have now, is feedback loops. Because suddenly now we have, in the smallest places, a highly digitized sort of process. And yes, we have all these concerns about data privacy and all that, but we also have the ability to get feedback from citizens from places that we've never had that opportunity before.
We do not, at the end of the day, see the value that data can give to us, right? It's seen as taken away from us. क्या कर सकते हैं इतने बड़े big tech hai, ye log hai, what can I do at the end of the day? It's just something, there's also, yes, there was a conversation around the culture of privacy. What does it mean? But also the translation of data into something which has a potentially public good effect. We do not see that.
You do need the data. We realize that we have the technology to put it to certain uses which have social value in some sense. But the thing is, there are things like, what is the purpose limitation? All those sorts of questions are there. And I think the larger problem is not with the rejection of the technology. It's not to take that kind of an approach, but really we are not asking the right questions at all.
Would you say that a telephone directory is a kind of data commons from the past? That is to say that it's a compilation of individuals' phone numbers, addresses, and stuff like that. But when it's collated and it's kept in a lot of public places, but also in homes and stuff like that, does that produce something like data commons?
The modern state has had the monopoly of categorization of the data, right? So information collection under particular framework, under particular regime has been a monopoly of the state over a period of time for last 300 years, right? Suddenly that is something that is changing.
Can we even imagine building DPI without private individuals and entities?
When we are talking about open sourcing the code, let's look at the data security first. And also when we are doing this, let's look how this data will be, if you open source, how it will be hacked. We are opening too many Pandora's box.
So just want you to sort of reflect on the way then we sort of build resistance to whatever these corporates are doing. I mean, if we are saying that, and to what extent then we should look at state.
Earlier, government used to contract out private companies to build public sector technology and have a lot of what is called vendor dependence, right? And vendor lock-in. And then they would just have to keep relying on the same company to keep upgrading it, to make any changes, and every time have to incur sort of, use our public funds to make all of those changes. In the DPI approach, it's actually completely the other way around. I don't think that, making the underlying code of the platform open source has any implication on people's personal data being in the public domain. Like they're two technically different things.
A very, very efficient engine in which billions of dollars have been, not millions, billions of dollars have been put into creating the most advanced techniques of trying to figure out that if you're going to scrolling through a New York Times article because of your reading habits and etc., right, I will auction an ad in microseconds to be able to give you in that scroll. Imagine the efficiency of that, right?
This public-private distinction, I think, has never been terribly useful in practice. It's good to teach in class.